My name is Jeremy Kredlo. I am a grandfather and permanent custodial guardian for Kylie, who is 14 years old now, almost 15. And I have been raising her as essentially a single parent since she was 8 months old. So my journey in advocacy began with her for about 14 years ago. And over the years, I found and realized that advocacy is a skill that many, it's a life circumstance that and a need that many people find that they have, but it's not a skill that is taught as often as it could and should be. And so I started volunteering my time to teach advocacy classes, including this one, which I first started teaching about 6 years ago through the Washington State Fathers Network. I have since become a certified coach in advocacy through the Living Proof Advocacy program, as well as starting a business called Fierce Advocacy. I'm in the process of writing a book. And most importantly, I continue to teach this and other classes to try to help people become better advocates for their loved ones and to drive policy and legislative change. And I will pass that over to you, Matthew, for an introduction.
Hello, my name is Matthew Rickman. I am the director of the Washington State Fathers Network, which is a program of kindering. The Fathers Network focuses on raising the voices of all male-identifying individuals who have a child in their life with a special health care need. A big focus for me is using storytelling and play in order to engage the whole family. We're creating new programming, new workshops on how to use play therapeutically. I'm a certified therapeutic game master and a certified problematic gaming specialist, which just means I have extra training on how to use those games to learn skills and to gain more tools in your work to communicate and socialize and everything else. And looking forward to doing this presentation with Jeremy. Thank you.
All right. Yeah, make sure my technology is working correctly. It is. All right. So here's what we're gonna focus on today. High level on the agenda. Gonna go over our workshop norms and materials. Talk about what we're gonna hope to accomplish today. Dive into what is a story with a purpose. So what's that actually mean, and why and when you would use this. Focus a little bit on how to use this particular tool set to tell your story effectively. We'll give a live example. I'll give a live example of what this looks like in real time. Then we'll go through some exercises so you'll get some hands-on experience with this, preparing your own ask. So what it is that you're advocating for and how to flesh that out a little bit. We'll go over putting it all together, which will be a practical hands-on exercise for you to create your own story with a purpose for at least practice purposes, and then a brief wrap up and next steps. This is going to be a relatively large workshop. I'm not sure how many people are actually going to show up, but we've already got 20 or so sitting in the room. So a few things to keep in mind. There is an agenda. We've got a certain amount of time that we have together today and a significant amount of material and exercises to go over. So while I want this to stay informal, I want it to be more of a conversation and not me just presenting the whole time. If we do start getting to a point where conversations go off topic and we start diving down into rabbit holes that aren't really focused on the material and the agenda, I'll do my best to facilitate bringing us back to our agenda so that everybody can get out of here on time and everybody can get what they came here for. If, however, you have questions, you need clarification, there's something that I didn't cover or that you just wanted to get a little more information about, ask questions. As was mentioned earlier, there's two different ways you can do that. If it's not super time sensitive and you're just wondering about something that you want a little bit more clarification, feel free to type that into the chat. Matthew will be monitoring the chat in real time, so he will be responding to those questions. If it's something that needs further clarification from me, he'll reach out to me and make sure that I'm aware of that. The other mechanism for asking questions is the raise hand function in Zoom. So if there's something that's time sensitive and before I move on to a next slide, you really want to get clarification on something, feel free to use that raise hand function. That will Matthew will also be monitoring that. We'll call that out if your hand is raised, and we'll ask you to come off mute and ask your question. We're all grown-ups here, so if you need to step away, use the restroom, grab some more coffee or tea, take care of a child, whatever it is that you happen to need to do, feel free to go and do that. No need to ask permission or announce to the room or any of that. Just go and do what you need to do. If you miss anything important, feel free to type that into the chat when you come back, and we'll see what we can do to circle back with you to make sure you get what you need. And last but definitely not least, we're going to be talking about some things here that may be personal, they may be sensitive. So what you see here, what you hear here stays here. Okay? Please don't share other people's stories or experiences outside of this forum. This is a safe space where we honor confidentiality. Any questions on any of those? Does everybody feel like they can honor those workshop norms for today? If you have a concern or need clarification, go ahead and raise your hand. Otherwise, we can move on. All right, so here's what we're hoping that you all get out of the workshop today. We want to present a framework for advocacy opportunities. So we all have different types of advocacy opportunities. There's a lot of personal advocacy that happens. There's advocacy for other individuals. There's systems and policy advocacy. We want to present to you a framework that you can use for most, if not all, of those advocacy opportunities. A toolkit that allows you to focus your time and energy on your advocacy opportunity and step forward with your best foot, your best, most effective self to drive your advocacy opportunity to success. We're going to give you some questions to help you prepare for those advocacy opportunities, because preparation is vitally important in that success when it comes to advocacy opportunities. So we'll have some questions that we're going to take you through and that you can use in the future as well. We're going to talk about some concerns for various advocacy opportunities, things that you might want to be aware of and think about before you go to a legislative forum or whatever other venue it is that you're going to be advocating at, to make sure that you're setting yourself up for success. And we're going to give you an example of an advocacy presentation and what this looks like in real time, so that you can see that this is not just theory, and you can decide for yourself whether or not this is effective and something that you want to add to your toolkit. So, what is a story with a purpose? The way this course was originally designed by Seattle Children's Hospital. I took training with them to facilitate this, and the way that they define a story with a purpose is a short presentation that draws on your personal experience to advocate for policy or systems level change effectively and memorably. The key word for me in this definition is, or this description is, story, right? We quite often use facts and statistics when it comes to advocacy. We talk about groups of people, we talk about theory. We don't always effectively tell our own personal stories when it comes to an advocacy presentation, especially when we're talking to decision makers. And that can be less effective than when we are telling our own personal stories in a way that is powerful and emotionally connecting. And we'll dive into that a lot during the course of this presentation. This specific framework was designed for systems level policy and policy changes. So this is really designed to be a toolkit that you can use, a framework that you can use to speak with decision makers to drive systems level change, not personal advocacy, not I need to get a one-on-one paraeducator for my child, and I need to work with a specific decision maker to get that one-on-one paraeducator approved for my child. It can be used for that, but what it was designed for was talking to a governing body, a legislative change that is going to move the needle for everybody, not just you and your child, or you and the person that you are advocating for, or you if you're an advocate or an activist advocate. So this is really designed for systems and policy level change. But again, it can be used effectively for personal advocacy as well. So things you might be asking for: a change in a system, process, or practice. So I think there are barriers in many of the systems that we have to navigate, as you all, I am sure, are all too familiar with. That the processes are fundamentally broken. They're designed by bureaucrats. They're designed by people who don't actually have to use the processes or the systems. And so the barriers that are inherent in the system are legion. They're almost insurmountable for people. And we as advocates have to, time and time again, submit paperwork or go for approvals that really make no sense. So you might be using this framework to advocate for changes to those processes. As an example, you might say, look, it doesn't make any sense that I have to get denied 3 times before I can appeal for this process. That needs to change. Let me talk to you about why that's a barrier for me, why that is a challenge, and use your story to help advocate for that particular process or policy change or system change. Another use case for this is changes to policy or law. You may be meeting with legislators to advocate for a specific House bill. You may be meeting with a decision maker, a decision maker on a school board to try to change a policy on who qualifies for a one-on-one paraeducator, for example. Back to that earlier example. Those policies, those laws are what this specific framework was designed to address. You can also use this to advocate for funding for a new program or additional funding to preserve an existing program. So again, meeting with legislators who are about to go into budget reconciliation, and they don't necessarily understand. It is so important that there is additional funding for individual providers versus additional funding for RHCs in the community, right? They don't understand why that is. They don't understand the nuts and bolts around it. They don't understand what that means for people in the community, and that many people don't want to be in an RHC. They want to live in their community, and continuing to fund RHCs takes away funding from another more valuable program. So sharing our stories and using this work to communicate that can help them understand what that looks like and feels like, and why it is that they should be funding individual providers or respite care versus RHCs, as an example. At each of these slides, I'm going to go ahead and stop at the end and just ask if there are any questions so that I don't breeze past anything. Are there specific questions that you have before I move on? All right, I am not seeing any hands. So why share your personal story? In college, in business, I've been in corporate America for far too long. You know, one of the things that I hear time and time again is we make data this, and I see numbers and metrics and KPIs and all of these things that corporations say they use to make decisions. However, my experience and the research proves that that is not actually true. Data and graphs activate the logical part of our brains, right? We have the old left brain, right brain theory, creativity versus logic. And in that theory, we believe that one side is artistic and one side is rational. Data and graphs, metrics and KPIs and numbers activate the logical portion of our brain. Whereas story activates all of our brain. It activates the creative center, the emotional center. It focuses on areas that are not touched when we are only seeing metrics and data and graphs. Sorry. What that means is we believe we're making logical choices based on those graphs. The reality is, research studies that have been conducted, as humans, we don't actually make logical, rational decisions. What we do is we make subconscious emotional decisions, and then we use logic and rationale to validate the decisions that we have already made subconsciously. You know, it's that gut feeling, it's instinct, it's whatever, all these words that people use to describe it. But the reality is we, as are emotional beings, we make subconscious emotional decisions, and we use facts and data to validate those decisions that we have already subconsciously made. So when we present something and we are using charts and graphs, we're fighting against a subconscious decision that has already been made. And if we want to change that paradigm, if we want people to really engage and understand, we have to get to the root of where that decision was made, which was that subconscious emotional decision. We have to get into the feelings. And data and graphs don't do that. Stories do. Stories evoke emotion. Stories evoke empathy. Stories evoke, and that is where the decisions truly get made. So as advocates, it is significantly more effective for us to get down to that emotional core as the basis of our presentation than to try to just focus on metrics and graphs. We can use that data to support the story, to support the decision, but it's really difficult. We're pushing a boulder uphill if we're only using metrics and data. Stories, personal stories also they invite us to identify with and support the speaker. When someone is sharing a story, a powerful story, we want them to win. They're the protagonist. There is a connection that happens and a feeling of support that wells up when someone is sharing their story. There's empathy that gets created, and we want the speaker to win. That doesn't happen with charts and graphs and data. We look for holes in that. We look for what's wrong. But when someone is sharing their personal story, we identify with them, and we take a journey with them, with that story, and we want things to turn out for the best. And so it creates this emotional connection that doesn't happen through other types of presentations. Stories also create a shared experience that leave a lasting impression. So when we share a story, when we share an experience, even if we think about things like movies or books that we have read that are stories, there's a lot of information. There are a lot of things that happen that we remember. They create a lasting impression on us because we're sharing that experience with the storyteller. When things are not couched in a story, when they are just a series of facts and figures, we tend to forget them. I've been to probably over 100 different professional development seminars in my life. And I probably remember 2% of the things that I learned in all of those professional development seminars. But the 2% of what I remember are because there was a story involved. The teacher, the facilitator told a story, and what it was that was contained in that story is what I remember. All of the rest of it, in one ear and out the other. I forget it within a week, sometimes a day. So that container that gets created with a story creates that shared experience. And now there is a lasting impression that I can remember details I wouldn't otherwise have remembered. And stories create that connection that allow us to identify with the speaker. Again, there's an empathic bond that gets created with storytelling, where we start looking for similarities with the protagonist, the storyteller, the person who's sharing their lived experience. And we start thinking about how we are similar to them instead of thinking about how different we are. So even if my lived experience is significantly different from someone else's, when they are sharing a story, I start finding commonality. I start finding connection. In fact, there's a research study that was conducted where audience members and the speaker were hooked up to EEG machines. And when the speaker was telling their story, the research proved that the audience members were actually having a similar neurological experience as the facilitator. The person who was speaking had certain parts of their brain light up when they were describing different senses, different experiences that they had, and the audience members were actually experiencing that same neurological phenomenon. It's called neurocoupling, and it's a very powerful connection between the speaker and the listeners, and it creates that connection and then empathy that then causes all of the things that are different to kind of melt away, and people focus on what is common and where that connection comes from. That was a lot of theory on storytelling. And that's the end of that slide. So I want to stop there and see what questions you have before we move on. Questions or any hands being raised? All right. So this is the recipe. This is the framework, 7-step framework that I use, that I teach in this class to help people prepare for a policy advocacy event, a systems level advocacy event. There's 7 steps to the process. This is generally based on giving a 3 minute or so long speech or presentation. You can modify it for your own particular needs, but 3 minutes is what it's geared towards, because that is about the amount of time that you will get when you're at a legislative forum, when you're at a town hall meeting, when you're in many of these different types of advocacy events where you are up in front of a room of people talking about why what you are advocating for is important. So we base it on about a 3-minute speech. And these are the 7 steps that we believe are the most effective for making the best use of that 7 minutes. Step 1, start out with an introduction and thank your audience for something they have already done. Okay. With an introduction, I like to keep that very light. My name, one brief reason why they should care who I am, and maybe a pertinent fact that is going to be something that is important for the story I'm going to tell or the policy change I'm going to advocate for. I don't spend a minute and a half talking about myself at the beginning and try to put my life's history and my whole story and give them all of this context. I just need them to know who it is that I am and why they should care. So, for instance, my introduction may be as simple as, my name is Jeremy Kredlo. I live in the 47th district, and I am the grandfather and custodial guardian of a heavily disabled child. That, boom, 10 seconds or less, they have enough context to now know, oh, that's his name. He's in my legislative district. He is advocating for a child living with disabilities. That's probably going to be important. Gives them enough context to know, but they don't have to listen to me talk for a minute and a half about who I am to understand why I am there. That's important because you want to keep this brief. It's very similar to, if you've ever been a hiring manager or have you ever read anything about, resume submittals, there's this theory that on average, hiring managers will look at a resume for no more than 7 seconds before they make a decision, right? It's very similar when you're advocating. The people that you are talking to are going to start looking at their phones or reading the next briefing or thinking about what they're having for dinner if you spend the first minute and a half introducing yourself without getting to the point. So keeping it brief, making sure that you don't drain that introduction, but they're not confused about who you are is important. That's step one. Step two, make a connection with them through some common ground. Doesn't matter what the common ground is. It's going to be different for each advocacy event, for each person that you're talking to. But we want to create a connection with the listeners. If it's one person, that's easier. You can potentially do some research ahead of time to understand a little bit about them. If it's a group of people, it can be a little bit more difficult, but there are still things that we can do to make that connection. For example, if you are speaking with a legislator and it is a one-on-one session, you can do some research and find out, first off, you live in their district. Great. There's a connection. Maybe they're a veteran and you're a veteran. Great. There's a connection, right? Maybe they are someone who, maybe that they have children. You have children. Great. There's a connection. So finding something that puts you in the same group in some way, shape, or form can be very powerful to creating that connection. For more generic advocacy events, I often just use legislative district, or school district or those types of things where I know I don't have to do a bunch of research if I don't have time, but my name's Jeremy Kredlo. I live in the Kent School District, right? That's enough to make a connection because I'm talking to the school board in the Kent School District, right? There's a connection there. Many of you also have children in the Kent School District. All of that can happen through just that simple phrase to make that connection. But we want to make them feel like we are on the same team. So many of these people that we talk to on a regular basis for advocacy, what they experience day in and day out is people telling them all the things that they're doing wrong, all the things that are broken and how they are the problem and they need to fix it. They have very adversarial relationships a lot of times with the people who are coming into their offices or coming into these advocacy events. We want them to, at the onset, feel like we are on the same team. And making a connection through some common ground is a way to start with that narrative to help them start to feel like we are on the same team. Which can be very important. We want them to be on our team. We want them to feel like we're on their team the whole time. Third step, sorry, I skipped something. I'm going to go back on step one. The second part of step one is thank your audience for something they've already done. That's the beginning of that journey I was just talking about, of feeling like they're on the same team. We want them to feel appreciated, if at all possible. Thanking them for something they have already done can be as simple as, I really appreciate the time you're taking to meet with me today. Or it can be much more robust and help people feel even more important. Example I'll use later in the story is, I want to thank you for the strong advocacy work you did in the 2016 legislative session by passing the Down Syndrome Information Act bill. All right. That's very specific. If that person was a sponsor or co-sponsor or supporter of that bill, it makes them feel seen. It makes them feel like you value what they've already done. You're starting out with gratitude. You're starting out on the same team. Okay. Then we move to making a connection through some common ground. Step 3, state your request at the beginning. So what I was taught for most of my business career was wait until the end. Don't tell them what you're asking for. And then once you've kind of buttered them up and given them all the facts and figures and done the whole sales pitch, then you give them the big reveal. It's kind of like when you go to a car lot and they won't tell you how much the car actually costs until you're at the end of the sales pitch. And then they're like, oh yeah, it's going to be $25,000. Oh, but we can drop that down a little bit. But that $25,000 is a sticker shock because you haven't seen that the whole time. We want to remove that. We want these people that we are talking to know exactly why we were there and exactly what we are asking them for at the beginning of our advocacy presentation. And we want that because we want them to be focused on what we're saying. We don't want them thinking, the whole time we're talking, thinking, what are they going to ask for? 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 If that's what they're thinking the whole time, they're going to lose the impact of what it is that we are saying and the story that we are presenting. We don't want that. So we want to give them right up front, here's what I'm here to ask you for. I'm here to ask you to co-sponsor this bill. I'm here to ask you to allocate this amount of money for this program. I am here to ask you to stop funding this other program, whatever it happens to be. We want to ask them tell them in very specific terms what it is that we are going to ask them for as a result of this presentation. Gets it cemented in their mind at the beginning. They're no longer wondering about what it is going to be, and now they're more focused on what it is that we're saying, and they will start to see the correlation of why it is important, which we will reinforce later in the framework and the presentation. Step 4, and kind of the focus of this whole framework, is telling your personal story. So, one of the challenges that we experience time and time again in the advocacy community is the people that we are speaking with, the decision makers who have the power to drive change, have little to no lived experience with what it is that we are advocating for. They don't know what it is like or why it is important to drive for these changes. They don't know what it is like to be in my case, a single custodial guardian of a total care child. They don't know what my life looks like. They've got no context whatsoever. And so when I talk to them about something like the importance of respite care or barriers to getting therapy services, they have no experience with that. Everything that they are hearing is through their own lens of, well, I don't understand why you don't just get a babysitter, right? That's the lens. If they have a neurotypical child, a completely able child, they're like, I mean, really, you're just talking about like $5 an hour. What's the big deal, right? I mean, they don't have any of the lived experience that is necessary to understand why what we are advocating for is so vitally important. Sharing our personal stories, a small slice of our life in a way that is emotionally connecting and powerfully impactful, can help them get at least a little bit of an inkling of what this is like and why it is important that this particular change gets supported, whatever it is that that change is that we are advocating for. Without that story, they don't have any context. They won't experience any context. And the story, again, evokes empathy and emotion. And empathy and emotion is going to be the catalyst for them wanting to know more and wanting to support this. It's not going to be the dollar figures. It's going to be the emotion that you evoke. So giving them that personal story that evokes emotion is going to be what helps them get closer to being an advocate for what it is that you are advocating for. Okay? When I talk about a personal story, I'm not talking about your life history. This is another a challenge I see time and time again in the advocacy community. We've all had a lot of things that have happened in the 5 years, 10 years, 30 years, whatever it happens to be, that we've been living this life. And all of it is vitally important, and all of it is impactful, and all of it so much of it needs to change and there needs to be so much better support in the community. But it's too much to put into a 3-minute presentation. And when we start diluting our personal story by trying to cram 30 years of lived experience into a minute and a half of a story, it loses all of its power. Tend to find specific experiences within the 14 years that I've been raising Kylie. I find specific moments in time, specific experiences that can create at least a glimpse into a moment of time, a day, a week, a month, whatever it happens to be, a moment that was particularly poignant, particularly heartbreaking, whatever it happens to be, and use that as the basis of the story, not the whole lived experience. Because again, that loses its power if we try to put too much into that minute and a half to 2 minutes that we're going to use to tell this story. Step 5 is connecting the dots. We're sharing a story. We're asking for a specific thing. Now, we want to very explicitly call out, this is why what I am asking for is important. When I talked about this experience with Kylie, that experience would have been much different if we had a funding for this program. And there are many other children who would also benefit from this. We want to connect the dots for the listener, because again, they don't have this lived experience. We've told them that we're asking for something. We've shared a story about it. That does not mean that they're going to understand the connection between what we're asking for and the story. We want to explicitly call that out. We want to say, it was the 3rd time in 4 years that I lost a job because I couldn't find caregivers, right? Additional funding for individual providers is vitally important. I am asking for you to raise the minimum wage for individual providers by $1.50 an hour, because like myself and so many others in the community can't hold down a job if we don't have caregivers, and caregivers are not going to stay. The turnover rate on caregivers is going to continue to be incredibly high if they can go to McDonald's and get a job making the same amount of money without having to, take additional certifications and do all of these other things. So specifically calling out the connection between your lived experience in your story and the request that you're asking for, and connecting those dots for that listener helps to reinforce the message as to why they should be on your team, why they should drive this change. Don't leave it to their imagination. Don't assume that they're going to make that connection intuitively. Give it to them on a silver platter. Here it is. This is why. Step 6, thank them again. We want to keep them on our side. We want to make sure that they understand that we do appreciate them. This is a partnership, not an adversarial relationship. So we thank them again through whatever means we have. Really appreciate your time here today. Thanks for listening, whatever it happens to be. But end with gratitude. And the last thing, step 7, tell them again what it is you expect them to do. We don't want any ambiguity. We don't want any misunderstandings. We don't want anything to get in the way of, before you step off that stage or turn off the microphone or whatever it is, we want them to know, I am here to ask you for $50,000 to fund this program in this year's budget reconciliation process. Make sure you're crisp and clear on that. That should be the last thing that they hear from you, is what it is that you are asking them for, so that they know 100%. All right. That was a whole lot. There have to be questions on that, I would imagine. But if not, that's fine. We can move on. But I'm going to stop and make some room for that, because that was 15 minutes of me talking at you.
Or you do raise your hand.
Yeah.
I would, so one way to thank them is to thank them for their past efforts on your behalf, saying yes on a certain bill. And if you don't know what that is, you could contact the Arc of Washington or look at their bill tracker, and they have all the bills and what they are for.
Yeah.
That way you can, and then from that point, I don't know how to get to my legislator, but I'll figure that out. On what their voting record. You have to go, find the bill, then find your legislator, look and see if they voted yes or no, or stuff like that.
Yeah, it's a great call out. And that's the type of research that can really help. If you have those specific examples, if you do that type of research and you're talking to a specific legislator, for instance, that definitely makes them feel seen, right? Like, we really appreciated you supporting House Bill XYZ. That meant a lot to the people in my community, right? Most legislators don't get that. They get, again, people coming in and yelling at them about what's not working, not thanking them for their past support. So the Arc of, any of the ARCs, the Arc of King County for me, and then the legislative district tracker. I don't remember where the link is, but there was a link that allowed you to go to different legislators' homepages that had their voting records on them. But it's been a couple years since I clicked on that. What other questions or comments, folks?
Another question was if you're able to put the whole recipe together to see an example, and I know that you'll do your whole presentation at some point soon.
Thank you, Matthew. Yeah, we're going to go through a live presentation of what this looks like, but one of the exercises that we're going to do later has both, you're going to do this, you're going to go through all of those steps and create your own. And there's also an actual written example of what this looks like from someone who was in a previous class who submitted that'll show you what this looks like when you write it out and kind of break it down. So there will be a couple of different examples throughout the course of the rest of the morning and afternoon. Any other questions before we move on? All right, so that's the recipe. That's kind of the basis of the framework. There you have some handouts that should have been sent to you and are also going to be posted in the chat if they're not already. One of those is a template called Telling Your Story worksheet that has all of these steps listed out. with spaces for you to write in the blanks on what you would be doing on each of those sections. So it breaks down your potential advocacy presentation into these 7 steps and lets you fill out each step kind of one by one, so you have a template to work from. All right, so what does this look like? Right, when we're talking about an actual telling your story with a purpose presentation, what does this look like in real time? What's the practical example versus the theory? So we're going to do this in a workshop for, again, later today. You're going to go through a workshop and do this yourselves, but here's the basis of it. We're going to later create a fictitious audience. Who are we talking to? In this case, I'm talking to a group of legislators, right? And I am there to advocate for a specific purpose. I want sponsorship or co-sponsorship of an amendment to an existing bill or RCW. Okay. That's what I'm there for. That's the fictitious audience that I'm going to be talking to. In this case, I have 3 minutes to present this to this group of legislators, and I have done my pre-work. I've done my research. I know that some of these legislators were involved in sponsoring the original bill that I want amended, and I am going to meet with them to try to get them to sponsor or co-sponsor an amendment to that RCW. Yeah. So that's the context of this particular advocacy opportunity that I'm going to do a presentation for. I want you to go ahead and listen, and then after this, we can talk about whether or not I hit all of the steps in the presentation, and questions about whether or not, or what did or did not resonate. And we can talk about any of what worked for you, what didn't work for you, or any questions you have. Okay. So this is what this looks like in practice. Hello, my name is Jeremy Kredlo. I live in the 47th district in Kent, Washington, and I'm the grandfather and custodial guardian of Kylie Hartke, who is a 14-year-old young lady who lost oxygen and suffered extensive brain damage at birth. I want to thank you for meeting with me today, and more importantly, for your strong legislative advocacy work in the 2016 legislative session, where you helped sponsor and get passed the Down Syndrome Information Act, House Bill 2403, which made it a requirement for healthcare providers to give access to information around resources associated to Down syndrome at the time of a Down syndrome diagnosis. Like many of you, I'm a parent, and in fact, I'm a grandparent of 2 granddaughters. My oldest granddaughter, Kylie, came to live with me when she was 8 months old, with a series of very debilitating medical conditions, including extensive brain damage, seizures, and cerebral palsy. We spent Kylie's first birthday at a children's hospital. And through a series of appointments, we found that her eyes didn't seem to be working correctly, and ended up meeting with a pediatric ophthalmologist who did a series of tests. And after that series of tests, as I was sitting in his waiting room, he came out, looked at me and Kylie, and said, Kylie has 100% cortical visual impairment. It is a combination of scarring on her optic nerves and damage to the occipital lobes in her brain from the loss of oxygen at birth. She will never be able to see anything, including light and movement, and we have no treatment options that will help her. And that was the extent of the information that I was given at the time of that diagnosis. It hit me like a gut punch, like it had taken the wind out of me. Despite all the diagnoses that she already had, for some reason, this was the one that made everything seem real. And I sat there in that waiting room with Kylie on my lap and tears running down my face, feeling this confusion and fear around what I could possibly do. What could I possibly do to support her? I'd never raised a child who was blind. I didn't know where to even start. I didn't know what access to resources looked like. I didn't know anything about this. And I didn't know who to even go to talk to about it. Kylie and so many other children in the state of Washington, the 143,000 children who are on IEPs or who have other diagnoses, would benefit so much if their parents and guardians were given information and access to resources at the time of diagnosis. Early intervention services would start earlier. Access to therapies would start earlier if the healthcare providers who had the information gave that information directly to the parents and guardians at the time of diagnosis. So I'm here today to ask you to co-sponsor an amendment to House Bill 2403, the Down Syndrome Information Act, to expand the diagnosis list to include all diagnoses of intellectual, developmental, or physical disabilities, and make it a requirement that healthcare providers give access to those resources and information at the time of diagnoses. I want to thank you for the time that you spent with me today and for your strong advocacy work in the 2016 legislative session. And I want to challenge you to capitalize on that strong advocacy work and expand the diagnosis list for House Bill 2403 by co-sponsoring an amendment. Thank you. All right. That was an example of using this formula, this framework, this recipe for an advocacy opportunity. As I went through it, I realized I missed one step. Shame on me, but that's okay. If you didn't know the recipe, you wouldn't have known. So that's fine. Let's talk about what worked and what didn't work. What stood out for you? How did it feel? What improvements would you like to see? Was there anything where you had a moment where you're like, oh, that makes sense, that doesn't make sense? Just have some open dialogue about what this looks like.
At the beginning, I was confused about the connection between the Down syndrome bill, and then you brought it together at the end, but you didn't say at the beginning what the connection was.
You are correct. And that is exactly the step that I missed. So in the recipe, there is that step of early on, tell them why you are here, right? I did not tell them that I was there to expand that diagnosis, to ask them to expand that diagnosis list. I missed that step. I forgot that one entirely as I was talking. Had I done that, it would have tied it together earlier. But what probably happened to you is you were like, where's he going with this, right? What is he asking for? Where's the connection? That's why step 3 in the process is so important, to tell them why you're here and ask right up front. Here's what I'm here for. It helps tie that connection together. Great call out. I didn't know if anybody would catch exactly which one it was that I forgot. That was the one. Other thoughts?
I noticed a lot of pauses. I'm a web designer and we use white space to create visual, to target attention towards the places that you want to listen. And I was wondering if the pauses in your speech were intentional, because when I talk, I want to say everything really quick and get it out and over.
That's true of almost everybody. It's a natural tendency, especially if you're going to get on stage, if you're going to get in front of a bunch of people. You know, public speaking is most people's greatest fear. I've spent years and years training in public speaking, including many years in Toastmasters. A lot of the pauses are one of the most powerful techniques that you can use when giving a speech, because using that white space, as you called it, as a web designer, gives people time and space to think about what you just said. If you just keep talking and you just keep talking, people are focused on what you're saying, not on what you just said. They don't have time to pause and reflect and really feel the impact of what was said. So generally, when I'm doing any type of public speaking, if I have really planned out the speech, I will use pauses at the appropriate times for dramatic effect. What I did today, I don't have written down. So this was all done on the fly, which is why I forgot one of those steps. But I've also told this story quite a few times using this framework. So some of those pauses were very deliberate. Some of them were just, okay, where do I go from here? Right. But either way, it can be very powerful for helping people focus on a point that you just made. What else, folks? What stood out for you? What areas were like, he kind of lost me there, or I didn't see the point of that, or I wanted to dive deeper into that? All right, well, let's move on then.
Oh, there's two comments that just came into the
Oh.
chat. So the first one says, I noticed the length of your personal story was short but effective. How do you choose the most pertinent detail?
Practice and repetition. So when I first did this, we used to teach this class with a video of me telling this story that we took at Seattle Children's Hospital. And when I walked into the video center there, they have like a AV room where they do videos. I walked in and I had 4 pages of meticulous notes of exactly what I was going to say and how I was going to say it, down to every word. And I'm sure it sounded very smart, and I'm sure it was wonderful, but I never got the chance to actually use it, because as soon as I walked in and sat down, the woman who was doing the video walked over and snatched it out of my hand and said, "You won't be needing those." And she did that because she wanted the video to feel natural. She wanted it to be the way in which I would give a speech to legislators in person, not reading off of a piece of paper. So I went through 10 or 11 different takes of that video before we got one that felt natural and organic, but still contained all of the right information. What happened as a result of that also was my story got shorter and shorter. My story got more and more pertinent. The details got very pertinent. So for example, when I first started, I listed out every one of Kylie's diagnoses. I had a list of 11 or 12 at the time diagnoses. Kylie has been diagnosed with cerebral palsy and hypoxic ischemic encephalopathy and just on and on and on. And I listed all of those out because I thought that would make a bigger impact on the listener if they had this long diagnosis list. But the reality was, just using 2 or 3 was enough to drive the impact home, but still shorten the story. So those things started falling away naturally as I practiced more and more. The other thing that really helps, and helped in that situation and in subsequent presentations, is feedback. Practicing this with other people, especially other people in the advocacy community, but just really anybody, and listening to their feedback about what worked and what didn't work. When somebody, like in that instance, it might have been, yeah, you talked about all these diagnoses, but like by the third one, I kind of got lost and I didn't really care about them anymore. Oh, okay. Then I'm going to lose some of those details. I can save myself some time, still have the same impact, not lose my listeners. So listening to that feedback from other people as you practice can be really, really helpful in finding the details that are important and then that stand out and that drive the most impact. So I practice all of my stories, whether they're advocacy stories. I tell stories on stage as well. I practice all of those with groups of people that I trust to give me honest, open feedback. And I listen to that feedback. I don't always do what they say, but I always listen to what they say, because Neil Gaiman, sci-fi writer, one of the things he said is like, anytime that somebody tells you that something is wrong with a story, they're probably correct. Anytime they tell you how to fix it, they're probably incorrect, right? So I listen to what people say. They may give suggestions on how to fix it. I'll take that with a grain of salt. But if they tell me something's wrong and they got lost in the story, or they felt like it was too long or whatever, I need to listen to that. I need to hear that, because if they're saying that, other people in the audience are feeling that. Legislators their eyes are going to glaze over. If somebody says, "Oh, you kind of lost me here," other people are going to get confused. I need to tighten that part of it up. So listening to that feedback from people and practicing and refining is a vital part of the process if you want this to be as effective as possible. The thing with advocacy that I have found time and time again is it's like many things, we really only get one shot at this, right? We don't get mulligans or do-overs when it comes to trying to advocate for a certain thing. If I go to a legislator and I want them to sponsor a bill, and I totally blow that opportunity the first time, I don't get to come back next week and try again. They've already made up their mind. They're not going to change. They're not going to make a different decision. So I want to make sure that I walk in there with this as powerful, as polished as possible. So if that takes me having 6 meetings with other people to refine it and get feedback before I walk in there, that's what I will do, because I don't want to blow my one shot. If it's important enough for me to meet with somebody about this, it's important for me enough for me to practice and get feedback and do the work to make it as effective as possible. I don't know whose question that was, but did that answer it?
Yes, thank you.
Mm-hmm. What else was in the chat? Go ahead.
We got 2 questions. One was a statement question. I'm wondering if we couldn't make a stronger connection by using questions that may have a connection to something they have also experienced, which may have been some sort of similar to their experience. Making connections by asking questions about related experiences.
Yeah, that's absolutely, my opinion is that's an absolutely valid technique. You can, have you ever just really enjoyed just the joy on their face when they were swinging on a swing for the first time by themselves, right? Like, oh yeah, I felt that. That was a wonderful experience. I remember like asking that question, okay, how would you, and then you share a personal story about the swing sets not being accessible for your child, right? Like now you've made that connection with them. Then you can also tie it into the story and what you're advocating for. So it's a very valid technique. And can actually be questions in a like legislative forum type of session where you're up on stage, that they know it's a rhetorical question, right? You're not waiting for an answer. And also be careful that you're not asking questions where people are going to answer and it may not be the answer that you need. So if you're going to use questions, ideally you want to use a rhetorical question that everybody would answer kind of the same or similar. You don't want to walk into a room and be like, have you ever done X, Y, and Z? And everybody in the room is like, nope. You're like, oh, okay. That's awkward to recover from. So just be careful if you're going to use it, but it can be a very powerful technique if you use it right. That answer your question? Your question about questions? Yeah.
Yeah. And then another question is, what are your thoughts on using note cards to help us keep on track with the presentation?
it is 100 times more effective to have note cards and use them than to not have note cards and forget what you were supposed to say. So note cards are a tool. They can be a great accommodation if that's what you need. It's certainly more effective to not have note cards or to not have, a speech that you're reading off of a piece of paper or whatever. It feels more organic. It feels more natural. But that takes time. It takes practice. It takes a whole lot of public speaking skills to be able to do that. I've been doing this for 6 years. I forgot part of my presentation. I forgot one of the critical steps of something that I teach and have been teaching for years. So I would say that if that is your comfort level, absolutely use note cards, use whatever accommodations that you need to give you the sense of comfort that you're not going to forget something. And also just the sense of comfort that helps you move past the stage fright. If you don't do this every day, getting up in a legislative forum, getting up in front of a school board and giving a speech is nerve-wracking. It is really, really scary. Public speaking is not easy. It is something that people are very, very afraid of. You start going into fight or flight mode. Your adrenaline starts pumping. Is it Malaya? Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
You start speaking really quick. You want to get it all out, right? All of those things happen. So yes, use whatever accommodations work for you in whatever way is going to make it the most effective for you. What I do that's most effective for me is I take my entire speech, I write out my entire speech word for word. I practice that many times. I refine it many times, and then I take it and I just turn it into bullet points at the key transitions. And that gives me enough to go, oh, this bullet point, this bullet point, this bullet point. And that gives me enough. If I get lost, I can glance down at my card real quick, see the bullet point and go, oh, that's where I'm going next. Did that answer your question? Yeah.
And then we've got some comments and then another question. The comments are thanking you for the vulnerability with sharing your story. Appreciate the vulnerability without overpowering your purpose. They said it's your story, but it didn't sound like you were telling for your personal need. It was
why I chose that story, or why a different story might not have been appropriate at this time. Okay.
And then the last question I have in chat is techniques. What techniques have you found that help you with the fear of speaking in public, or with someone who is an authority figure?
Yeah. So the fear of public speaking, I mean, there are a few things that first of all, I used to be afraid of public speaking. Back when I was in middle school, it was my biggest fear. Well, second after heights, but whatever. That one didn't come into play that often. I took some public speaking classes. I was still afraid of it. I ended up going to, joining Toastmasters. I ended up went away as a result of what I would involuntary immersion therapy, right? I just had to do it. And so I just kind of worked through it. I was just constantly exposed to it. What the technique that works the best for me for any type of presentation where I'm really nervous is practice. The deeper I know my subject matter, the more knowledgeable I am about exactly what I'm going to say and exactly what my purpose is, the less stage fright I have, the less fear I have for authority figures. If I know that I know what I'm talking about, I'm confident going in that I am not making this up as I go along. That takes probably my fear. So no, feel like people are going to just pick it apart, or I'm winging it, or any of that. And that solid foundation of knowing what I'm talking about and exactly what I'm going to say really helps me move through that fear. So I think that's the most actionable thing that people can do is get this dialed in ahead of time and practice it and practice it and practice it over and over again. And you'll find that it's much easier to get up and do this once you feel like you know exactly what you're going to do. That takes away a lot of the fear. Not all of it. Don't get me wrong. The more of this you do, the better you will get and the less fear you will have. But it takes the edge off. I also do things like I meditate, do breathing exercises, right?
Ugh.
Calm myself down, do some yoga or some Tai Chi before I'm going to do like a huge presentation. I've got up and done presentations in front of 300 and 400 people before. And, on stage with an audience like that, it's like, okay, back behind the curtain or in the green room or whatever they happen to have, I'll do a little Tai Chi, gets my body moving a little bit, center myself, those types of things that take me from like heart rate up here down to, okay, I feel in control.
I had another question about protecting your loved one's privacy. So
Yes.
my daughter, this is recorded,
Mhm.
like speaking in front of the school board or speaking in front of the legislative body, it's recorded. And if you use their,
Mhm.
and right now she's a minor, so I guess I have every right to do that. Uh, uh, to insure or life insurance or something, but like I want to share, but
That is an absolutely valid concern, and it's actually one of the things that's later in the presentation as well, where I talk about making sure that not only are you comfortable sharing this information, but that your loved one is comfortable with you sharing this information, not only now but for the future. Right? There was, I will, for example, Kylie. Part of the damage to her brain was to her hypothalamus. Her pituitary gland and her hypothalamus were both impacted, along with most of the rest of her brain. The pituitary gland is what regulates hormones, right? So Kylie actually started puberty at 3. Right? And there's a host of things that come as a result of that, right? There are stories about that I am not going to share in public. I mean, they could be used for advocacy. She realistically will never be impacted by me sharing that because she doesn't have the cognitive ability to, she's not going to check social media. She's never going to have a job realistically. So she's probably never going to be impacted by that if I share those stories publicly. But I still, out of respect for her, don't feel like it's something that I want to do. And so I choose not to share those stories, even though they could potentially be used for advocacy purposes. So I just choose other stories and or other advocacy opportunities when it comes to that. So I do filter what I'm going to share through the lens of how would she feel about it? And is it fair of me to share that? So it's a very personal decision, obviously, right? It's all about where your level of comfort is for your daughter, you and your daughter, and what you want and choose to share. But it is definitely something that to be aware of and something to factor into your decision-making process. Right. So
Right, this my story would be about removing the cap on special ed and how special ed has helped, and just it was a bit. So if I say my daughter receives it, I wouldn't necessarily have to say her name, or I could use the alias, the name that she came up with herself.
Mhm.
Perhaps I don't know. Yeah.
and depending on how old she is, and maybe it's a discussion you can have with her about her comfort level, depending. I don't know. I mean, again, I don't know all the details or
Right.
any of that, and it's a very personal decision on how you approach that. But just the
Well,
fact that you're
yeah.
thinking about that is
One
important.
day I hope that she has, goes to college and uh things like that.
And yeah, and you don't want that, showing up on somebody's social media, um, and having want to have shared publicly, right? Jill, your hand is up.
Hi, yes, I was just going to share, oops, yeah, my hand's up lowered. That for me, for all three of my kiddos, they are now young adults and can share for themselves. But I still, when I share my story, I have over the course of their lifetime, from the time they've started speaking for themselves, always have talked about, since my work from the time they were relatively small has been about advocacy. And their story has been a part of my work, and made sure they were aware of that. And how would they like me to share that as part of their work? How would they like me to, and I'm, for lack of a better word, fortunate in that process that they are aware and have the wherewithal to be able to share with me how they would like that to sound, what would they like that to be, and then, but that also helped model for them how they wanted to share their story, whether it was at an IEP meeting, whether it was standing in front of other people around that, whether it was legislatively or whatever it was. And then for them, as they stood up and provided information in front of other people, whether it was just saying my child, my son or daughter, or I am the parent of, or I rarely ever use their names. And they get to choose whether they want to use their names or not. So that's how I've done it.
Thank you for sharing that. That's it's a great model. I mean, it allows for consent, which is obviously, I think, Malaya, what you were driving towards, right? Like, how do you make sure that there's consent, and not only now but in the future, right?
Right. So that is just something I'd practice my pitch in front of her and get her feedback. But, she's 11 and really can't consent because she doesn't know what she's going to think about it in the future, right? Her brain hasn't developed that far. So yeah, I like the idea of saying my child because I have two, and it wouldn't yeah, you couldn't trace it back to either one.
Okay, so here's some things to think about as you start developing what it is that you're going to ask for. So you're planning to attend an event of some sort, you're going to do some advocacy work. What are you actually asking for? Here are a few things to think about as you're developing that. So first, what is the actual change or problem that your child is facing, or challenge or problem? Think of a problem that affects other children and families too. So this is, again, systems and policy advocacy, systems level advocacy. What is the actual root cause of the problem that you are facing? Trying to get as crisp and clear on that as possible is important. The system sucks and it's broken. That's, while it is true, yes, Nelson, I see you. While that is true, that's probably not something we're going to be able to tackle by going in and doing a 3-minute presentation in front of some people. So getting really crisp on what it is that your very specific problem or challenge it is that you're facing and that other people are facing that you want to tackle, so that you can really focus your energy, your time, and be as effective as possible. Going into an advocacy opportunity and just having a broad statement about how bad everything is not very effective. It's not going to give the listeners anything to actually do as a result of your presentation. So we want to get very crisp, very clear on our ask, and we want to make sure that it is something that addresses the root cause. The example in the story that I shared, the presentation I shared, right? When Kylie was diagnosed as blind, I didn't get any information. I didn't get any access to resources. I didn't know where to go. I didn't know who to reach out to. And that is because the people who had the information were not required to give that to me. There was no mandate for them to say, oh, your child has a diagnosis of cortical visual impairment. Here are resources, or here's information on who to reach out to for next steps to do what needs to be done. Instead, there was a vague, like, we'll set up an appointment in a year. And like that was about it, right? I don't know where to even start. I made dozens of phone calls to different places to try to figure out even what was available and what I should be doing. I wanted to tackle that problem. I wanted to get very specific on how can I make sure that other parents and guardians don't find themselves in that same situation of trying to fight for access to information when the people who have the information are sitting right in front of them. Oh, hey, this Down Syndrome Information Act was passed. You know what happened? You know why that was passed? Because other parents did this exact same thing. Parents of children with living with Down syndrome went and advocated for this same type of information. I could do the same thing, but I could expand that diagnosis list. So I got very crisp on what my ask was. What's the problem or challenge that I'm facing? That helped me develop my ask, right? But if I wasn't clear on what the problem and challenge was, I wouldn't have known what to actually ask for. So that was key for me to really get to where I needed to be in my request. So thinking about how it affects other people. One of the things that most of these decision makers are going to want to understand, or that is more powerful for them, is this a you problem, or is this all of my constituents problem, right? What's the scope of this? Am I helping one person? Am I helping 10 people? Am I helping 10,000 people? If you want to get very, cynical about it, how many votes is this going to get me if I get this thing passed, right? Like they want to understand, just like anybody, what is the problem that I'm trying to solve worth the energy that I'm going to put into it? How many people are going to benefit from it, right? So if they don't know that, we want to give them that information if at all possible. So how does this challenge affect others? Oh, there are a lot of people. If you noticed in that presentation, I used a figure that may or may not correlate 1-for-1 to the actual ask, but it was directionally good information, which was there's 143,000 children on IEPs in the state of Washington, right? 143,000 children on IEPs. Now, not all of those children are going to benefit from expanding the diagnosis list, but directionally, it gives the people an understanding of the scope of what I'm asking for. They're like, oh, that's a lot of kids. 143,000 kids. Wow, right? Again, these people probably don't have the lived experience to understand what this means unless we give them and explain to them what we're talking about here, right? They're like, oh, how many kids actually have disabilities? How many kids are living with disabilities?
That's got to be like at least 100, right? In the state of Washington, they have no idea. Totally out of their realm of experience, potentially. So we give them something. This is how it affects other people. It's going to affect a lot of other children in the state of Washington. What is it that needs to change, right? In this case, it's parents need access to information and resources as close to the time of diagnosis as possible. That's what needs to change, right? Okay, I got to get crisp on that. So really dialing in what's the root cause and how can the root cause be addressed? And who has the power to make the change? So making sure that we're talking to the right people at the right level at the right time to drive that change. You know, if I need a one-on-one paraeducator for Kylie, I'm not talking to the superintendent about that, right? But if I'm talking about making a fundamental change to the way in which paraeducator accessibility is defined in the state of Washington, I'm talking to much different people than I am if I just want a one-on-one paraeducator for Kylie, right? If I need to drive that change in how that assessment is performed, that's school board, superintendents, that's, it's way up the chain. So figuring out who has the power to make that change and make sure I'm talking to the right audience is important. All right, this is my soapbox moment. Okay. Are you asking for more than just support or awareness? I see this so often when it comes to advocacy of any type across the board, right? People asking for support or awareness. As a decision maker, what do I do with that? If somebody comes to a legislative forum or a school board meeting and they're like, I need you to be aware of the challenge that children with IEPs face in the school system. Here's these challenges. Okay, I'm aware. Thanks. What do I do with that information? First off, I'm probably not going to do anything with it because I've got 700 other problems I'm trying to solve, right? Now I'm aware of yet another problem. It's going to the bottom of the list. Okay, I'm aware of it. Coming to decision makers with problems and not solutions is not very effective. You can ask for support, you can ask for awareness. You may even gain some traction in terms of allyship where they're like, oh yeah, we want to support you. But because they don't have the lived experience and because most of these people are very, very busy, they don't have time to go research the possible solutions. And they don't have the resources to go research the possible solutions. They're going to focus on the areas, the problems that they can solve. So if we're going to go and we're going to shoot our shot at an advocacy opportunity, we want to give them the solution. We don't want to ask for support or awareness. We want to ask for $50,000 for funding for a program. We want to ask for the diagnosis list for House Bill 2403 to be modified and amended to include all disabilities, intellectual, developmental, and physical. We want to reroute $250,000 from RHCs to individual providers in the community. We want to increase the living wage for individual providers from the current to $2 an hour more. We want something very specific. We want to hand them the problem, but we also want to give them the solution. Because if they have a solution that they can implement without having to go do a bunch of research and a bunch of work, they're much more likely to actually do it. If we just give them a problem to solve, all we're doing is dumping our problem from our plate to their plate. What we want to do is give them a problem that has already has a solution attached to it and say, look, here's a problem. I've explained how bad of a problem it is. I've helped you see what the impact of this problem is. here is a solution. All I need you to do is write this check. All I need you to do is sponsor this bill. That's all I'm asking from you. If we only ask for support or awareness, we are not giving them a solution. We're just giving them a problem. It's a big problem. It's overwhelming. I don't even know how to solve it, but I wanted you to make you aware it's a problem. Great. I know it's a problem. What do I do with that? I add it to the big old bucket of other problems that people expect me to solve. That's what I do with it. Right? So if you're going to put the time and effort into advocacy opportunities, please make sure you are coming to the table with a solution that you're handing to that decision maker. It will be significantly more effective. You'll get a lot more traction. And that's the end of my soapbox. Okay. All right. What do you want your listener to do? That's that repeat that ask. What's the very specific thing? Do you want them to write a check? Do you want them to amend a bill? Develop that as you work on your ask. What is it? Very specifically, not vague, not, do better. I need you to do better. Well, okay, great. That's pretty subjective. Make it very specific. And help them, or as you're thinking about your ask, think about why it matters. Because that's going to help why it matters to you, why it matters to other people in the community, because that's going to help you develop what it is specifically that you're asking for. More importantly, it's going to help you develop what story you choose to tell to reinforce the point. Right? Why is this important? It's important because in the example that I used, why should they amend House Bill 2403 to expand that diagnosis list? It's important because it gives children access to early intervention services. It leads to better outcomes. It gives parents and caregivers who are already overburdened access to information and resources quicker without having to do a bunch of research so that they can get back to work and do their jobs. There's a litany of different benefits to making that small change in that particular RCW. I need to understand that so that I can decide what story I'm going to tell to drive that ask forward. All right, questions on that? Thoughts, feedback, contrary opinions?
Would you say that if you could provide facts and figures that it would improve the lives of all Washingtonians if they increase the spending on such and such with this research paper, blah, 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 or?
I think that
like increasing spending on education, increase the outcome of like 3.2% poverty rate, lifting, whatever.
Making your speech only about facts and figures doesn't grab that emotional portion of the brain. It doesn't do the strength. But liberally sprinkling in facts and figures that are beneficial outcomes as a result of what you're asking for can be very powerful and very influential, provided that you've already made that emotional connection. So when I said 143,000 students who are on IEP, that's an example of that. When you're explaining why, as one of the steps, there's why is it beneficial to you, explain why it's beneficial to you and others, right? Making that connection for your listener, that's a great place to sprinkle in. Research has shown that, access to early intervention services has led to a 52% increase in graduation rates, whatever it happens to be. But making it more conversational. I mean, don't whip out a pie chart or something like that. But that reinforcement of the scale and the scope and the benefit can be very powerful. That's a great place towards the end of the presentation to drop in some facts or figures. But you don't want to do it to the point where their eyes glaze over. If you have to get them to be an ally first, once you've got them, then there's always the love to talk to you about this more. In the future, I've got a bunch of research that we can talk about what the benefits are, but dropping in just enough to get them kind of like set the hook, if you will, can be very powerful.
Yeah. Okay. The benefit is better, and like more taxpayers in the future with high, yeah, or something. Yeah. Okay.
Sure. Vocational programs lead to people in the disabilities community, a 27% increase in people in the disabilities community having active full-time jobs versus being on SSI full-time, right? Which translates to X number of dollars of tax revenue. Like that, sure, that can be a powerful benefit that you add on to help people understand. Michelle.
Wow, Jeremy, I want to put you in my back pocket. I'm just like blow my face up. Do you ever consult privately for parents working on huge projects?
I do, yeah. There's at the end of the presentation, there's a bunch of contact information. So if you want to reach out to me, that's I'm going to do a PDF version of this that'll get sent out to everybody, so you have it for your purposes, and it'll have that contact information on it.
Okay, amazing. One of the things that I'm trying to advocate for is a very, very large project, and it's going to cost billions of dollars, and our state will never pay for it. So it is a special education dashboard for parents to go to for all things for their child's special education, which would eliminate the need for records requests, school education records, FERPA records. It would eliminate the need for a records archivist and a paper pusher. We would get rid of paper pushers. We're going to go digital. We're going to stop the insanity, and we're going to have a portal for parents to go to for all special education needs. It could be general education as well, but the burden of proof is on parents in our state. I don't need to tell you we're exhausted.
Yes.
If I have to look at another piece of paper and categories and build spreadsheets and data and graphs and charts and write, I mean, it's a full-time job administratively. It's insane.
Not to mention that many people, from an accessibility standpoint, many people don't have those skill sets.
They don't have the skill set
or any of that, and certainly not the time.
Right. And so if we had something like a My Chart for special education, it would go from child find all the way to graduation, and all of the data would be there. And it would prompt you, you have a message, you need to schedule an IEP meeting, you're missing an evaluation. We need this data, we need this, where's the progress report? Like, you could compile it and it would graph and chart it for you. So you could see the progress the child's making in real time. We have the technology to do this. It's already being done all over the world, except in education. I will tell you, my whole entire life is digitized except mental health and education.
So what you're thinking about is, it's a fantastic opportunity, but to your point, you're not gonna win over the crowd with a 3-minute presentation. Like, you're talking multiple layers of decision makers and a huge project, and like this is an initiative. This is not a like, hey, I'm gonna go get this one or funding for this very small program at the school board level. So yeah, I can see the scope.
This is a huge initiative, and it's going to cost a lot of money. This is not Seesaw, Clever, Skyward, Family Access. This isn't Schoolology or Canvas. This is a portal for parents and special education teachers or gen ed teachers, where we can go to one place and we can pull up anything that we need, whether it become child find, evaluations, IEPs, progress reports, independent evaluations, report cards. All the data and evidence is going to be there. So I can stop requesting the data and the evidence. I want to stop requesting it because I don't have time for public records requests. Understand.
So let's reach out to me offline if you want to talk about like help for that specifically. We can get into that.
Excellent.
Other questions before we move on? No. Okay. So as you're developing your ask, those are things to think about. So what we're going to do now is we're going to take about 15 minutes and we are going to, we actually have a choice. You can either do this independently or we can head into breakout rooms. That is, if you want just quiet time to do this yourself, that's fine. Or we can set up the breakout rooms. What we're going to do is you are going to each independently decide on a practice advocacy topic. It doesn't have to be real. Don't over-engineer this. This is just for purposes of this particular class. We don't have to use these in the future. It's to help you learn the framework and get some practical examples. So you're going to decide on a advocacy topic. What's the advocacy topic that you're going to focus on? Like mine, it was access to information at time of diagnosis, right? That's the topic I want to focus on. Pick something along those lines, not necessarily like mine, but something that is just an advocacy topic where you would go and be meeting with people for systems or policy change, right? You're going to decide on a fictional audience. Who are you talking to? In my case, it was a group of legislators. It may be a school board for you. It may be the local police. It may be the parks department for accessible playground equipment, whatever. But make sure your audience makes sense for the advocacy topic that you're talking to, so that as you're framing out the rest of your story and exercises later, you have the right level of decision maker that you're talking to. Figure out your challenge or problem. What are you trying to solve? What is it that you really want to focus on that, in my case, I didn't know where to go, didn't understand who to talk to, didn't have access to resources. That's my challenge. What do you want your listener to do? What's your ask? I want you to write a check. I want you to change a bill or a law. I want you to change the assessment process for how caregiver hours are computed for individual providers. And then figure out and clarify why what you're asking for is important, not only to you, but to others as well. Okay. We're going to take time-wise, let's see, I think 15 minutes. If we get back early, that's fine. But this is going to be the basis for your individual exercises later. So please don't take this 15 minutes as a break. Think through these questions. I'm going to leave them on the screen. Please write out for your own purposes what these mean to you. Again, don't over-engineer this. This is just practice. You don't have to use this in the future other than for this class. It's just an opportunity for you to walk through the framework. What's your topic? Who's your audience? What challenge are you trying to solve? What do you want your listeners to do? What's the solution that you're asking them to implement? And why is that problem and what you're asking for important to you and others? Okay. Questions before we do this? No? Okay. There's going to be a quiz later, so take it seriously. Not really, but all right. Then let's. All right. We are at our time for that. I'm going to assume everybody was able to come up with their advocacy topics, their audience, their challenge or problem, and the potential solution that they're asking for their listeners, and why that is important for other people besides you. And we're going to go ahead and move on in the interest of time. Just want to validate that I'm still sharing my screen and you're seeing the presentation at this point.
I see the timer.
Okay, let me stop that. Stop that. Thank you. And how about now? Yep. Seeing the presentation now? Yeah. Okay, great. All right. So at this point, you should have the basis for what you're going to be asking for, what you're advocating for, and how you think that can be solved. And we're ready to move on to framing this up and getting your story together. So putting it all together. We're going to go through this again. This is the 7-step process. I'm going to talk through each of these at a high level again, so that we cement that. And then we're going to move into the exercise of actually getting this figured out for each of you individually in breakout rooms. So introduce yourself. Thank your listeners. High level, keep it relatively brief, 10 seconds, 15 seconds, somewhere around there. You don't want to drain all your time talking about yourself. And you want to make sure that you're thanking your listeners, even if it's something as simple as, I really appreciate you being here today. Thank you for your time today. Just something to immediately generate some goodwill from them and let them know that they are valued and appreciated. That's a great way to start out to get people on your side. Make sure you decide how much you want or need to tell them to keep it brief, to keep it as brief as possible. Don't give them all the unnecessary details, just enough for them to know why you are there, who you are, why they should care. Try to make a connection with them. Again, legislative district, both veterans, both parents, whatever it happens to be, find some way to make a connection. In the story that I told earlier, the presentation I did, if you noticed towards the beginning, I said, like many of you, I'm a parent. Okay. That was me making a connection. It wasn't a huge connection. It wasn't a big deal. I didn't spend 30 seconds talking about it. I just got us into the same group. Like many of you, I'm a parent. I have 2 daughters, right? Oh, suddenly there's an emotional connection. Oh, I'm a parent. I know what that feels like. That's what happens in the listener's mind. That helps put you into the same group. That there's a connection there. Now we have a shared experience. That's a great place to be. This is the part I forgot. I'm here to ask you to co-sponsor an amendment to House Bill 2403 and the RCW associated with that to expand the diagnosis list on the Down Syndrome Information Act to include all intellectual, developmental, and physical disabilities. That's what I'm here to ask you about. State that request, give people a solid foundation for what you're asking for. Be specific and brief. I didn't just spend 30 seconds talking about that. Boom. This is exactly what I'm asking for. Didn't take that long to say it. It's very specific. I'm not here to ask for awareness or support. I'm not here to ask you to co-sponsor a bill. I'm asking you to co-sponsor an amendment to this specific bill in this specific way. Very specific, very brief. Okay. What needs to change, be improved, done differently, discontinued, or funded? What needs to change? This bill, this RCW needs to be amended. It needs to be amended in this way. So very specific. That's the first 3 steps in the process. Okay. Step 4. Oh, sorry. Any questions on those before we go on? Okay. Step 4. This is your story. Minute and a half, maybe 2 minutes. And if it's a really robust story and you're able to use the beginning and end and get those nice and tight, but this is not the Odyssey. This is not your life's journey from start to finish. If you noticed the story that I told in the example, very specific moment in time. Kylie was a year old. It was her 1-year birthday. We were at a children's hospital. We went into the pediatric ophthalmology appointment. I was in the waiting room with her. The doctor came out, gave me a diagnosis. It was literally in the space of a couple of hours that all of that happened. That was the beginning and end of my story. I did not go into all of the details leading up to that, all of the details after that. I kept it to that because that was what was pertinent for what I was asking for. That was an impactful story that reinforced why what I was asking for was important and how it felt, and created that shared experience for those people who were listening, ideally. Right? Talk in a personal manner about how this issue and challenge has affected you and your family. First person is always great for this, right? Not lumping people into a group, not talking about everybody who experiences this issue. This is a personal story. It's really about how this has affected you. We're going to make the connection later about how it affects other people. But we want to create the emotional connection and the emotional experience of how impactful this was for you, whether it was positive or negative, but something that is going to tug at the heartstrings in some way, shape, or form and evoke an emotional response from our listeners so that they feel what we felt during that time and they have a visceral emotional reaction to that. Back to what I was talking about at the very beginning about how people make subconscious emotional decisions. That's where we want our energy to go. We want people to have, oh, that must have been horrible, or, oh my God, that's beautiful, or whatever that reaction is. We want them to feel that so that they then are looking at this through the lens of, I want to help. And they've made that subconscious emotional decision of wanting to help, of wanting to change something, of wanting to be part of the solution. Once they have that, the rest of it is layered on, and it gives them the rational, logical validation and justification for doing what they have already decided to do internally, emotionally. So we want to get to that tugging the heartstrings portion. We want them to feel. Once we've got them to feel, that's when they're going to take action. This one can be very difficult in a lot of the spaces that we work in when it comes to advocacy. Trying to use an example that points to positive future outcomes, right? It's very challenging to find stories of, oh, everything's wonderful. If everything's wonderful, why are we here advocating, generally speaking? That's not usually where we spend our time and energy in advocacy. We're usually trying to fix something that's fundamentally broken. We're trying to really focus or shine a spotlight on something that really needs to change because it's really painful. It's really difficult. It's really exhausting or whatever. It's really fundamentally unjust, right? That's where we typically focus our energies. That's okay to share a story like that. The short story that I shared in this example was not a happy story. It was a diagnosis of Kylie being blind when I thought she could see. That's not a happy story. But if I and other people like me in that situation are given access to resources earlier, children are going to benefit as a result of that. They will have better access to services. They will have better access to information. They will have better outcomes due to early intervention being started earlier. That's the positive future outcome that we want to focus on. So we take our listeners through the course of this journey from down into the valley of despair and then back up, and we leave them in the light. You can be part of the solution. You can make all of this better. The future can be so much brighter if only you write this check, if only you sponsor this bill, if only you do this thing, everything will be so much better. You can be the hero. That's the feeling we want to leave them with. So we want to try to use an example that points to those future outcomes, that leaves them in the light, that gives them the feeling that if only they do this one small thing we're asking for, everything is going to be so much better. We want to leave them with that hope. If we leave them in the darkness, and despair of a really dark story, and we don't give them a path forward, that's not going to generally create advocacy. It's not going to create allies in our advocacy. It's going to create people who feel like there's nothing that they can do. So we want to leave them in that light of the future outcomes. Right? Which is why we explain why the request is important and beneficial to others, because it takes them from that darkness back up into the light. Here's Kylie and so many other children like her. Kylie and the 143,000 other children on IEPs in the state of Washington can benefit from access to information at the time of diagnosis that'll lead to this and this and this. That connection of why things are important and beneficial to others helps leave our listeners in the light. What does that look like? How could other people benefit from the ask? Early intervention services earlier, better outcomes, more access to resources like therapies, those types of things. So listing those out, providing examples of those that you're listeners might not know about, making that connection for them is important. What are the results that can be achieved? Better outcomes from IEP service or in IEPs, better graduation rates, whatever that happens to be. Some of those, Malaya, some of those statistics that you were talking about earlier, this is a great place to insert those, right? Increased graduation rates, those types of things, putting those in here, these are the results that could be achieved. We want to thank them again. We really want to thank you for all of the strong advocacy work you did in the 2016 legislative session by sponsoring and getting past the Down Syndrome Information Act. I'm thanking them again, right? And then we want to reiterate the request. But I want to challenge you to capitalize on that strong work by expanding the diagnosis list to include all intellectual, developmental, and physical disabilities. That's what I'm here to ask you. Sponsor and amend this RCW. I want to leave them with that very specific ask. In many ways, I am challenging them. I'm giving them homework. I'm saying, look, I'm going to check in on you in 2 weeks. I don't say that explicitly, but I want them to feel like you should walk out of this room knowing exactly what I expect from you. And I'm going to hold you accountable to that. There should be no confusion about what you're asking for. This is much harder than it sounds. We've generally told people what we're asking for 3 times at this point, right? We've explained it at the beginning. We've explained it through the course of why it's beneficial and the story that we've told. And then we state it again very explicitly at the end. The years that I've been teaching this class, people still don't know what I'm asking for at the end of my presentation. I've asked for feedback. I'm like, we used to ask that question, like, what was it that Jeremy was asking for? And we get random answers that are all over the place. Communicating clearly is great, but just because you're saying something doesn't mean somebody is hearing it and understanding it, right? They're listening to your story. They may not necessarily walk away with the same interpretation of what you were asking for. We want to be as crisp and clear and repetitive as possible to make sure that this is 100% solid. We're not using a bunch of different language. We're not being vague. We're really dialing in exactly what you're asking for. Following that up with written statements and proposals is always great if you have the opportunity to do that, or an email or whatever it happens to be. But reiterating your request and leaving that as kind of your walk away talking point is a good way to help cement that in people's minds. Okay, so that's the last 4 steps of the 7-step process. Questions on that? Now that we've been through it a couple of times. All right, I don't see any hands up. So earlier, there were some comments around vulnerability in the chat and around me sharing my story with vulnerability, but not making it feel like I was telling the story for me. It's a really important point, and one that I want everyone to think about as you're developing your story, whether it's for the purposes of this class or whether it is in the future. If you have so much anger or frustration or grief around a particular topic or a particular story that it's hard for you to talk about it in a constructive way, you're not ready. I can't state this strongly enough. If you get in front of a bunch of legislators and you start crying and can't get through your presentation, if you get in front of a bunch of legislators and you are slamming your fists on the table as you're giving your speech, if you get in front of a bunch of legislators and you feel like you can't breathe because your chest is so tight and you are struggling to even get through your story, you are going to take the focus from what you are advocating for and put the focus on you. And that is not what we want. It becomes a group therapy session and it's about you. It's not about what you're advocating for any longer. Okay? The story that I told about Kylie and the grief that I felt in that moment was very real. And I would not have been able to tell that story even here in this limited class 10 years ago. I would not have been able to get through it without that ball of grief welling up, without my chest tightening up. I was not ready to do that. I had to work through that. I had to get through the emotions associated to that and come out of the other side of that before I could talk about that experience in a constructive way. You can work through that. In therapy, you can work through that through practicing it, saying it out loud, doing the things that you need to do. But it is the wrong time. I know a lot of times what advocates want to do is try to channel that raw emotion as, oh, you need to feel this. This is how I felt. But there's a constructive way to do that, and there's a destructive way to do that. The constructive way to do it is once you've come out to the other side and you're ready. The destructive way to do it is with anger and grief welling up in the middle of your presentation. In the storytelling community, I do storytelling on stage for competitions, and I do it for entertainment. And we have a saying, which is, you tell a story from a scar, not a wound. If it is still a wound, you're not ready. Okay? And it's not fair to your audience. And more importantly, it's probably not healthy for you. You're going to do more damage and invoke more trauma for yourself. So please don't do that to yourself. So think about that. Practice your story out loud, maybe with friends. And if you feel that you can't get through it, or you're banging on the table or whatever it happens to be, maybe choose a different story, one you're more ready to tell. Malaya, do you feel comfortable sharing this information about your child or family member in public? I think we've talked about this quite a bit, or enough. I already addressed this. This is what I was talking about, where I said we would cover this later. It's one of the things to talk about, to consider when you're sharing your personal story. How would your child feel about this? How do you think your child would feel about this? How do you feel about this? Sorry. And then how would your child feel about this? Like, be cognizant, including how would your child feel about this in the future, right? Just some of these things live on in perpetuity, especially if they're recorded, to your earlier point. So consent and boundaries are very important. You know, we've had people who have shared stories and then later are like, ooh, I don't know that, I want that out there forever. So just consider whether the story is not only right for right now, but right for the future as well, and how people will feel about that in the future. Obviously, we can't crystal ball everything, but there are definitely things that are like, I think maybe this one is a little bit off limits. So give that some thought as you are getting ready to share your personal story and deciding on that. Okay. Any questions on those? All right.
I had an easy time with all of the framework except for that personal story part.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, that which one? How to make it short? How to
we don't have a bunch of time to dive into it. I do teach some mechanisms for finding stories, doing story mining. High level, I can find an artifact and share it with you as we're going into the breakout rooms for this. But essentially, I teach two techniques. One is a timeline technique. So think about your life with your child as an example in terms of key periods of time. for me, I chose like when we lived in Indiana, when we moved to Renton, and when we moved to Kent, right? And then I just put down what are some of the key moments, things that happened, right? Like there's all these different things that have happened over the years. Like I got her approved for HBOT, medical marijuana that helped her seizures under control, different experiences with doctors that were either horrible or not horrible. And I used a few key words to just plot those out on that timeline and go, this happened. What was it that happened in Indiana? Or is this? Oh, yeah, when she was diagnosed as blind. Oh, the time that her temperature started dropping and we had to deal with hypothermia, like all of these things. And I just plotted those out. Each one of those different moments is a possible story, right? Broken down and kind of shrunk down. The second technique is called first last. You know what? I'm going to stop talking for a second. And I'm going to share a different artifact real quick, if that's okay. Story mapping. This is the one that I was talking about, right? Timeline, birth to present. So for me, I took Indiana, Renton, and Kent. And then I said, okay, what are all the things that happened in Indiana that were key moments, right? She had a spinal tap. There were bruises on her face at one point in time before she came to live with me. The vision doctor, that was the point in which she was diagnosed as blind. A fireside chat with my dad that was really impactful. Things like that. Each of these were just different moments that as I thought back to that period of time that happened that could potentially be advocacy stories in one way, shape, or form. Not all of them are going to be great stories, but all of them are moments that I defined that stood out to me in this journey with Kylie. And when we moved, we were only in Renton for a year. Here are some things that happened there, right? And then in Kent, there was a whole bunch of other stuff that happened. And all of those key moments, I wrote those down as potential story ideas for advocacy purposes. I can take any of these and turn them into an advocacy, or most of these and turn them into an advocacy story for different purposes. But it gives me a story library to pull from when I'm starting to think about different advocacy opportunities. Like if I wanted to advocate for medical marijuana, for example, for seizure control, I've got several stories related to that, right? Because it's been fundamentally life-changing for Kylie. I don't need to tell the whole story of Kylie's life. I need to tell about that moment or that experience specifically. So that's one of the potential, the potential opportunities there. The second technique that I use for story mining is called first, last, best, worst. Okay. So I create a grid. I got categories on one side and then first, last, best, worst. Okay. And then I choose categories arbitrarily based on like, what are some, and I change these each time I do this exercise. Oh, what are some potential advocacy categories? Oh, doctors, IEPs, advocacy events, and social events. Those are some things that there may be some opportunities there for advocacy. And then I go, who was Kylie's first doctor? Who was her last doctor? Who was her best doctor? And who was her worst doctor? And I write those down. And each one of those, because they're in these categories of first, last, best, worst, evokes some memories, right? I have to think about this. Oh, yeah. Who was her worst doctor? Oh, that spine doctor. Like as soon as I say that, I know that there's a story there. I do the same thing for each of the other categories, right? IEP, her first IEP was kindergarten. Her last one was in 8th grade. What was the best one? What was the worst one? And then there's also some whys behind each of those, right? That come to mind. And then I go through those. And the way that I do this, you can do it however you want. But the way I do it is I think which one of these, when I was writing them down, gave me a really strong emotional response, right? Oh, that spine doctor one. Yeah, absolutely. That guy, like, I'm still pissed about that. Yeah, there's a strong emotional response there, right? There's probably a story there for advocacy purposes. So I circle that one, right? Now I've got each one of these that are potential additional stories for advocacy purposes. Those are the ones that had strong emotional responses and ones that I think I'm ready to tell. And then I go, oh, what about these ones? There may or may not be a story there. Not sure. And I may or may not be ready to tell it, but I'm going to circle them as something to look at in the future. I'm at least going to write them down as possible ideas. So that's how I define or find different stories that I may use and how I go from the story of everything that's ever happened with me and Kylie in the entirety of the 14 years that we have been together down to what are some moments that could potentially fit into a 1.5 to 2 minute present story for the purposes of these presentations. I will include these exercises in the handouts that we send out after that, in case that's helpful. And I know we didn't get into it, but there's instructions on these in this as well. So it'll give you a little bit better feel for how this works. Any questions on those before we pivot back? No. Okay. Great. I'm going to stop sharing. Matthew, anything in the chat I should be aware of?
Everyone enjoying the story mapping so far?
Okay, great. Thank you. All right. Share. Okay. So we only have about 20 minutes, I think, until lunch. Is that correct? Okay. So we're going to go into breakout rooms. You're each going to fill out your telling your story worksheet. So what that is that's one of the handouts, and it has the 7-step process with the questions or the recipe on it with each of the steps. And it gives you essentially a template to start figuring out what you want to put in each section, right? Make sure the story that you choose, and we didn't go over this a lot, so I'm going to talk about this a little bit. We all have stories. We want to make sure that the story that we're talking about, the story that we're sharing, is very relevant to what we're asking for. There needs to be a very clear connection. It's great if we can tell there's a story about our child, but if it doesn't reinforce what we're asking for and why we're asking for it, it doesn't really serve the advocacy purpose that we're looking for. So if I am looking for funding for accessible swing sets on a playground near my house, and I tell a story about a bad IEP that I was in, all I'm going to do is confuse my listener. Like that's terrible. I'm sure that was a terrible experience, but why does that matter when it comes to funding this accessible playground, right? We want to make sure that we are very clearly delineating and telling a story that's very relevant to what we're asking for. I don't know that we'll have time to review your outline with the group, but because we're going to be in breakout rooms, you can bounce ideas off of each other and say, hey, what do you think about this? And then there's a peer evaluation form to provide feedback. We won't have time for that, so keep that in your back pocket. It's great to hand to friends or peers if you want to practice your story. You want to give them that template and say, hey, I'm going to give you this presentation, and I want you to write down whether or not I did a good job. It's really good for generating feedback, because generally most people are not good at giving feedback, and they'll be like, oh, yeah, that was great. Like, okay, I need more to go on than that. Did I miss this step? How did this land? Like, giving them a template as you're asking for feedback and doing the presentation and practicing helps them provide more meaningful feedback when you're going through that. Everybody clear on what we're doing? Anybody not clear on what we're doing? How about that? It's a little less open-ended. Okay, we're going to go into breakout rooms. You're going to start filling out your telling your story with a telling your story worksheet. It's the template that you're going to use in the potentially, if you want to, in the future for crafting your advocacy presentations. You're going to make sure as you're doing that the story that you're choosing is relevant to what you're asking for and reinforces why it's important. And if we have time, you're going to review your outline with the group, or you're going to bounce ideas off of each other. And then at 12:35, if I'm not mistaken, we're going to break for lunch. So you got about 15 minutes, or 17 minutes, which is not a bunch of time to go through this. I'm going to stay here in this room. So if you have specific questions, you can pop back out of your breakout room to the main room to ask those questions. But before we go, are there any specific questions that you want to ask? Oh, sorry. One last thing. This is what this looks like when it's done. So this worksheet, this is what one of the self-advocates did in another class, right? Start with an introduction and thank you. So in this case, she filled out, hello, my name is blank. I live in the 5th Legislative District. I'd like to start off by thanking you for taking time out of your day to meet with me. In spring of 2021, like many of your constituents, I was living on a fixed income. I had the added barrier of having an intellectual and developmental disability. I'm here with you today to ask you to speak with your legislative peers and lead the next steps on implementing a policy on housing for people with IDD. In this case, this was a very specific docket. This was on the docket for the House meetings. She shares her personal story about almost becoming homeless as a result of rent increases and losing, not being able to afford their house or their apartment on a fixed income. She explains why. Reason why this one-pager policy on housing for people with IDD is so crucial is because not everyone with a disability is able to sustain or get a job. For a lot of those with IDD, SSI is their only source of income, which doesn't even come close to covering rent, even with having roommates. While there is low-income housing, the wait lists are extremely long, and it can take up to several years to even get approved. This causes our homeless IDD population to increase. The specific housing needs for those with IDD are not just currently being met. It's also greatly impacts those living in small group settings and apartments for supported living. Right now, as it stands, the budget only has funding for $3 to $5 million, which only pays for constructing 5 to 6 houses at a time. So she makes the connection very strongly on why this is important to herself and others, right? I want to thank you again for your time. And in conclusion, I ask you to implement and lead the next steps to ensure a policy on housing for people with IDD be implemented. So this is what filling out this template looks like, including the personal story in the middle. It gives you discrete steps and how to break this down so you don't have to be like, I don't know where to start. Okay, now we're going to go into breakout rooms and fill out your worksheets and get a start on what this fictitious at this point advocacy opportunity might look like and what you may want to present. So one of the things I see quite often is people go into the breakout rooms and then they kind of commiserate and they talk about the broken systems, but they don't necessarily dive into the framework and kind of come out of the other end with a draft of their story. Well, how was your experience? Were you able to kind of work through the templates and get some things down on paper and start figuring out where you want to go with this?
I got some feedback on the first time with the breakout that I'm gonna edit. It was useful to read it from the top because then you can find errors or skips in logic or things like that. And I really practiced looking in the camera and not swiveling because I had that feedback. I hope I didn't swivel. I should have asked everyone to tell me if I did that.
I actually have little post-it notes, little arrow-shaped post-it notes next to my camera, one on both sides, and one says look and the other says here. So when I'm
look here,
look here, so that when I'm giving a presentation and I'm talking to people via Zoom, I'm focused on that dot up there instead of people's faces down here, because when I do that, it doesn't look like I'm making eye contact.
Yeah.
What were your
what
were the big takeaways for people? Did you find something in particular that you like, a technique or some feedback or something that you found particularly useful in the session as you were working through your stories in the framework?
Yeah, like if there's cost savings, that might be a better thing to bring up instead of potential income from taxpayers.
Good point. Figuring out what what's in it for me is for the people that you're talking to, and making sure that it's really something that they're going to value, so they could, oh, hey, I can save, rather than increasing taxes, which is going to be a non-starter for a lot of legislators, they can, this is going to help balance the budget instead.
Right. Yeah. Reduce a line item or, yeah, balance the budget in their time while they're in while they are elected, if you could
Mhm.
do an immediate cost savings, that would be even better instead of a potential down the line type of thing.
All right. Well, anything else anybody else wants to share on your experience in the breakout rooms and working with the template and the process?
I'll share, Jeremy. I shared my screen in our group 3 and I read almost all the way through it. I think I did read all the way through it. Mine's super wordy. I can write novels, so the outline is what I really needed help on. Because I can go far left, far right, and I can write run-on sentences like you wouldn't believe. So I do need to edit it. It's still pretty wordy, but I could get, if it was a 5-minute presentation, I could do it. If it was 2 minutes, no way. But it was on one of my issues I'm working on is fire evacuation in my neighborhood. If you've ever been to Issaquah Highlands, we are cramped in here like sardines. In the event of a fire, we are in real trouble because there's only 2 roads in and out. And I'm working on getting trainings and drills and evacuation leaders by neighborhood. And so one thing you just said about focus on the benefits with Malia, that I should really put in my closing argument or my closing ask, the benefit of the community would be less panic, less chaos, less guessing, less invitation for accidents, and kind of run on that thought process of we've seen enough footage in real life to know what would happen if a wildfire were to quickly spread here. But that would be, I think the benefit also is because we outnumber our emergency personnel and our first responders. Like the ratio is crazy. We far outnumber the amount of people that would come in to help us and evacuate and save us and stuff. So I think we're way past due of some self-reliance here. So that's what I'm going to focus on is we would be less dependent upon our first responders and, emergency personnel and take more of an ownership role. And then, that would be less burden to, I don't know, our first responders or emergency evacuation people, because there's not enough people, period, to evacuate the 7,000 people that live here.
Do you have a personal story around that?
Well, my personal story, how I relate this to my ask, is that I'm a person who is on a fixed income with a special needs daughter who has a disability, and I will not have a way to drive out. I will not have money cash on hand, and I cannot carry her. So I have lived here long enough, and I've lived and worked here and been part of the planning process. I used to work for the developer. So my relate is that I'm a resident, I'm a community member, but we all don't have the means to evacuate in a car with $500,000 cash, like some senators we're not going to mention. But I also used Hurricane Katrina as an example because people who were stuck in Hurricane Katrina didn't have transportation, didn't have money for a hotel or gas, and had nowhere to go. And they were in the 9th Ward, and they were in parishes, and they were trapped. Are you there?
Yes.
Okay.
Sorry. I'm thinking about the story aspect of it in the middle of, was there a time that you were unable to get your daughter?
Oh, 100%. Snowmageddon 2019.
Okay. So using a story like that makes it real for people of what it was like for you to be trapped with your daughter and unable to get her to where she needs to be might be the story at the center of the presentation, right?
That's why they pay $1 million. I got it.
It's I was working for an organization, and I was a trained first responder for the organization. And our business continuity team was the one that did all of the training for first responders there. And it was free. You could do it during your work hours and all that. And they came to me. One of the guys was a good friend of mine, and he came to me because they just could not get people to sign up to be first responders. People just didn't care. They just, well, I'm too busy. I can't do it. And they just could not get people to sign up. And I told a personal story about a time that I saved a guy's life with CPR, which was 100% true story. I was the only one who was CPR certified. The guy had a massive heart attack, and I was able to basically keep his heart pumping until they got there with the EMTs got there with a defibrillator. And I told that story in the middle of all hands meeting, and they had dozens of people signing up before I was done with my presentation, and they had a 2-year wait list by the end of the week for first responders. But the only difference was, like, they had been talking about the importance of this, but they hadn't been using a real life story. And that made all of the difference in making it real for people. So
Yeah, that's so awesome. That's exactly it. You just nailed it.
there's a lot of power there in that personal story. So
Absolutely.
I think Snowmageddon 2019 might be
Snowmageddon. Oh boy.
might be like, and then you can extrapolate to that. And it was a snowstorm, but
Yep.
if it had been a fire,
Yep.
right?
Yep.
We wouldn't have been trapped. We would have been dead, right?
Oh, absolutely.
And so you can use that to make that much more real for people, it sounds like.
Yep. Yep. I love it. Thank you.
Yep. All right, folks, we are actually over the end of our time. I wanted to say thank you again. I really appreciate you being here. I hope you got something out of this, and it's going to be helpful for you in your advocacy opportunities. Keep using the worksheets, right? These are obviously reusable. It's a great tool and template to, like, kind of filter through these opportunities and make sure that you're able to organize your thoughts and your presentations in a way that is impactful and effective. Practice. I can't stress this enough. Practice, practice, practice. Before you get up there for whatever this advocacy opportunity is, practice, get feedback, practice again, get feedback. Even if it's just in front of a mirror, your language is going to get more natural. You're going to become more and more comfortable. As you get more and more comfortable, you're going to make changes to the way that you're presenting. It's going to feel more like a conversation, and people are going to relate to it better. So practice, practice, practice. Get rid of the stage fright as much as possible. If you know anybody that's going to benefit from this, send them my way. Send my contact information over to them. Contact Matthew. He coordinates a lot of these through the Washington State Fathers Network as well. So if you know other organizations that would benefit from it, that's great. My contact information is going to be in here. I'm going to send this out in a PDF format along with the finding your story exercises, also in a PDF format, so that you have that and you can use those for whatever whatever you need them for. That way you've got all of these tools and templates at your disposal, along with the contact information. So really appreciate your time and interest, and I hope that you go forth and do amazing things with these tools.